Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, the South African Wanderer, and this is then going to be part 2 of our series on understanding your camera and how to expose correctly in camera. And today's video is actually going to be about aperture. So in the first part, we spoke about shutter speed and how that affects the exposure of an image. And today we're going to talk about aperture, how that can be used to control exposure, as well as the effects that aperture would have on the final image produced by changing the aperture up and down. Just like how we spoke about with shutter speed and how shutter speed captures motion mostly. So before getting into aperture, I think we must touch on that history lesson I gave in the first part and speak about the camera obscura again. If you remember, the camera obscura was just a hole in the wall of a room that was used to then project light through a dark room onto the opposite wall and thereby create an image on the opposite wall. So one of the things that the people using the camera obscura found was the smaller the hole that you made, the sharper the image formed on the opposite wall would be. But this would come at the cost that because it's a smaller hole, you're letting less light through, and the image then created is a lot dimmer and less bright, basically. The other thing that the users of that camera obscura found was that you could manipulate the light a little bit using a lens in front of the hole that you used for the camera. So if you used a convex lens, you could shrink the distance needed to project the image on. So you could make the box or the room that you required much smaller. And then if you used a concave lens, what you could do is actually make the image you're seeing bigger. And if you think about it, that's how the human eye works as well. So your pupil and iris will control the amount of light entering your eye, with the iris being the hole that the light enters through. And then you've got lens behind that then can be manipulated, stretched, or squashed to focus either near or far and thereby see images. So the users of the cameras actually found that they could also manipulate light very similarly. So then aperture refers to the size of the hole that the light is passing through. In modern cameras, the size of that hole is actually determined not by the camera itself, but by a diaphragm on the back end of the lens. So if you look into the front of your lens at the right angle, you can see the diaphragm that is controlling the size of the hole. And when you change the aperture on your camera body, you actually then see that diaphragm closing or opening. So that is actually the aperture of the lens. But if you speak to someone who's been using the camera for a long time and is well versed in the use of the camera and the lenses, they will often refer to the aperture size of a lens by what is called an f-stop or a f number. So you'll often hear people saying f2.8, f4, f5.6. And one of the things that prompted this series was I was reviewing my 14mm f2.8 lens, and I realized that a lot of people may not know what that f2.8 actually meant. So that f2.8 or f4 number is not actually referring to the size of the aperture. So the absolute size of the aperture is actually meaningless because with different lenses having different focal lengths, that size or the diameter of that aperture for one lens could mean passing more or less light compared to another lens. So for instance, a 10mm absolute aperture size opening on a lens that has a focal length of, let's say, 14mm will be very different to a 10mm absolute aperture opening on a lens that has a focal length of, let's say, 50mm. So the f-stop or the f number is actually the ratio of the focal length of the lens over the diameter of the aperture. So for instance, if you hear someone speak about a 50mm f2 using round numbers, the ratio of the focal length to the diameter of the aperture is 2. So if the focal length is 50mm, then the aperture diameter is then 25mm, because 50 divided by 25 is 2. However, if you had, for instance, this lens, which is a 28mm at its widest, and you had it open to f2, the aperture that would be equivalent to f2 on a 28mm lens would then be 14mm. So you can see that the absolute size of the aperture is a bit irrelevant because depending on the focal length, the absolute size required for a specific f-stop will be different. So camera manufacturers quote f-stops on lenses as a measure of how wide the aperture can get or how narrow the aperture is. So because the number is a ratio of focal length over aperture diameter, a larger diameter means that the f-stop number will be smaller. So if the diameter was equivalent to the focal length, the f-stop number would be 1. And then as the aperture diameter decreases, the f-stop number gets larger. So if you then had a 50mm focal length with a 25mm aperture diameter, as I gave in the example earlier, then the f-stop would be 2. If that aperture diameter was only 12.5mm, then the f-stop number would be 4, and so on and so forth. So a larger aperture corresponds to a smaller f-stop number. So I think that is sort of the background that you need to grasp and get your head around when you are thinking about aperture. So then to understand how aperture impacts your exposure in camera, you just have to think about a circle that's opening and closing. The bigger the aperture, the more light it's going to let through. So the area of the circle in the diaphragm is going to let more light in. So therefore, f-stop setting that's very small, so a 2.8 or a 4, is going to give you more light into your camera. So it's going to increase your exposure. So for today's images that I'm going to use, I didn't need a figurine that had motion in it. So we're going to use this Lego Stormtrooper that I have just as the subject matter. And then we're going to play around with the images to illustrate how the aperture impacts the final image. So I did a set of images where I kept the shutter speed and ISO settings the same, and then I varied the f-stop. So I shot it with this 50mm f1.8 lens. So varying the f-stop from 1.8 and then increasing the f-stop and therefore decreasing the aperture results in the image getting darker and darker. So therefore, varying your aperture can impact your exposure, and you can use aperture, which is translated into your f-stop number, as a control of exposure. I think one of the things to highlight, however, is that besides the amount of light being let in, aperture also then impacts the sharpness of an image and how much of an image is sharp and how much of it is not sharp. So this is referred to as depth of field. So your camera can control where the lens focuses, and this focus is generally in a flat plane, which is perpendicular to the direction you're shooting in. How much of the image in front of that plane of focus and behind that plane of focus is sharp is referred to as your depth of field. And the main effect that aperture has is decreasing or increasing that depth of field. So it increases or decreases how much of the image is in focus or deemed to be in focus, and how much of it is not in focus or not sharp. So then I did a second set of images using my Stormtrooper and the lights behind, just to illustrate how depth of field changes with the changing aperture. If you look at the very first image, which is shot at f1.8, you'll see that the Stormtrooper is in focus, although the focus is on his head. So his feet may actually start already be showing signs of falling off in sharpness. But what you should be looking at is the lights behind the Stormtrooper, and you'll see that they are quite blurry. So in camera circles, this blurriness is called bokeh, which I think is a Japanese phrase for the blurred background in the images. And then as you increase the aperture, you'll see more and more of the image is actually sharp and in focus. So the focus point is still on the Stormtrooper's head, but as you go from f1.8 to f2.8, f4, f5.6, you'll see that the lights behind the Stormtrooper and in front of the Stormtrooper are becoming more and more in focus, and eventually almost all of the lights are in focus. There's one other impact that changing the aperture has. Like I said, the aperture is controlled by a diaphragm at the back of the lens, and this diaphragm is usually made up of metal plates or blades, they call them. So generally, it's not perfectly circular, the aperture opening. It's depending on the number of blades, you can get hexagonal or octagonal shape, which comes close to a circle but is not perfectly circular. But as you decrease the aperture size, as you get smaller and smaller, when you have light sources in the image, the light sources start to give what is called a starburst effect. So if you look closely at some of the lights on the shots at f16 and f22, you'll see that they have rays of light almost emitting from them. And this is the starburst effect. And this is actually sometimes a desirable effect because in things like cityscapes, you want to have those starbursts on the lights. And I'll put up an image that shows this. So it is a desirable outcome. Obviously, when you're shooting at f16, f22, the time that you need to expose the images for are much greater because you're not letting in as much light at f16, like we demonstrated. So that's a quick, almost rundown of aperture, its impact on depth of field, and the sort of the impact of the diaphragm blades on light sources. There are other factors that can influence your depth of field. So one of them is how close or how far away from a subject is. And that will actually impact how much of the image in front and behind the subject matter is in focus. If you are closer to the subject matter, your depth of field is going to be split more 50-50. If your subject matter is further away, what's going to happen is you're going to have more of the depth of field behind the subject matter and less in front. So it's just something to bear in mind, particularly with long lenses. The depth of field is also impacted by what is sometimes referred to as lens compression. So very long telephoto lenses can sometimes give more blurry backgrounds than wide landscape lenses, for instance. And I think that brings us nicely into where the applications for aperture and changing the aperture come in. So for portraits and wildlife and things like that, you want a very blurry background, a clean background. So you would shoot with the aperture that's very large. So a large aperture or a small f-stop number. So you'll see that a lot of portrait photographers will go for lenses that are very small f-stop numbers, so f1.4 or f1.8, because they want to just have their portrait subject matter in focus and the rest of the image blurry. With longer wildlife lenses, to get the f-stop small enough is a struggle. You need very good glass, and you need lenses that capture a lot of light at the front end, so that light lost along the length of the lens and then through the aperture is not detrimental to the image quality. So you'll see that wildlife lenses, your 400 mils, your 600 mils, have very large front elements and are, quite bulky and quite heavy because of the amount of glass that are in those lenses. You would normally get like a 300 or a 400 f2.8, and then as you get longer, the f-stop on a For instance, 600 generally would be f4. Very rarely you do get 600 f2.8. I think Nikon had f2.8 600 at one stage. And then 800 will be 5.6 again. So those lenses are desirable because of the background blur falling away, but also because the quality of the image is generally going to be better because the glass used in those lenses to get that f2.8 or f4 is also going to be better. And then on the other end of the spectrum, besides that starburst effect, landscape photographers generally tend to not want to have blurry backgrounds. They want to have almost all the image in focus. So landscape photographers will use wide-angle lenses that are set to f8 or greater, f11 sometimes even. I think one thing to recall, going back to the camera obscura and the sharpness of the image, stepping down on your f-stop does impact sharpness. So some lenses are not sharpest when they're wide open. So if you step from 2.8, for instance, down to f4, your f4, the image may be a little bit sharper. So compromising on the blurriness can give you a sharper image. And when you get to higher f-stop numbers, so f16, f22, you get some lenses that cause softness in the image again, because the diaphragms are then almost intruding in the image. I think of it almost as looking through your eyes. If you close your eyes and you look through the eyelids, so the slits of your eyelids, you'll see that the image does get a little bit blurry, and it's a similar effect in the lenses. So yeah, that's a quick summary of aperture. So I hope you did get some takeaways from the guide almost, and you can understand aperture a little bit better. I think one last point before I close off, the aperture capabilities of your lenses can be a big determining factor in purchasing lenses, and has been for my history of purchasing lenses. But I think that's something that we need to go into further discussion on a case-by-case basis, and discuss a little bit more in depth in terms of lens choices and things like that, because it's just one factor that comes into it. But it can be a very big factor in a lot of people's minds. People talk about fast glass and slow glass, and when they're talking about fast glass, they're talking about lenses with large apertures, which are fast because then you can use faster shutter speeds with the aperture wide open. So yeah, that I think is a little bit of a more in-depth discussion. So we'll close off the aperture video now, and then there's one more video to come in the ISO video. I promise this one will be a bit shorter, but it may actually be quite close to the shutter speed video, but let's see once we've edited. Okay, cool. I'll be shooting that ISO video shortly, so it will be up shortly after this video comes up as well.